My name is Ryan Carter, and until recently, I believe my life was on solid ground. I had a steady job as a systems engineer, a comfortable home in a quiet suburban town, and a wife, Emily, whom I trusted with every fiber of my being. We'd built our lives together over a decade, raising our 2 kids, sharing dreams, and even relying on a couple of practical safety measures. One of those was the family geolocation app, something we'd set up as a precaution. I never thought I'd need it. I trusted her implicitly. That is, until the day I noticed something was off. IT started on an ordinary Tuesday morning. I was preparing for work when, almost automatically, I pulled out my phone to check the family tracker. Usually, I'd see Emily's location blinking on the map, a comforting reminder that she was safe on her way to the office. But that day, her icon was missing. At first, I assumed it was a glitch, a simple app error. I restarted my phone, reopened the app, and still, there was nothing. My heart gave a small, uneasy thump, but I rationalized. Maybe she turned it off for battery saving, or perhaps she'd forgotten to re-enable it that evening, after a long day at work. I sat down with a cup of coffee and decided to take a closer look at our shared digital footprint. I scrolled through the app settings and discovered something even more disconcerting. Geolocation tracking for Emily's device had been manually disabled. I remembered our conversations about safety, about knowing where our loved ones were at all times. This was not an accident. The setting had been changed deliberately. My mind raced with questions. Why would she do that? Had something happened that I didn't know about? At dinner that night, I tried to mask my unease. Emily chatted about her day, about mundane meetings and errands. I listened, nodding along, all the while my thoughts fixated on that tiny detail. Every time she mentioned running errands or meeting with a friend, I wondered if there was more behind the words. The nagging suspicion grew steadily, until I couldn't ignore it any longer. I decided I needed answers. After tucking the kids into bed, I confronted her gently. I noticed your phone's geolocation was turned off today. Everything all right? Her smile faltered for a split second. Oh, that, she said dismissively. I just needed a little privacy for a while. Nothing to worry about. But the look in her eyes was too guarded, too distant. I pressed further, but she only shrugged it off. Changing the subject that night, I lay awake replaying every conversation, every small gesture. Her tone, her body language, the subtle evasion when I mentioned the tracker. I wasn't normally paranoid. I was a rational man, but that one deliberate act ignited a spark of dread. I began to wonder if there was a secret part of her life I'd never known. If she'd chosen to disable the app, perhaps it was to hide something far more sinister than a harmless desire for privacy. In the following days, I found myself fixated on the mystery. Every morning, I'd open the app, hoping to see her location pop up. Every evening, I'd check her phone settings when she wasn't looking. The pattern was unmistakable. For the past week, her geolocation had been off. My mind began to assemble a disturbing picture, a possibility that she was meeting someone without my knowledge. I started looking for other clues. I checked her recent texts when she left her phone unattended and noticed messages that hinted at secret meetings. A friend's name here, an ambiguous, see you later there. Nothing conclusive at first, but when combined with the geolocation setting, the truth was impossible to ignore. My stomach churned as I realized that this wasn't a momentary lapse in judgment. It was a deliberate effort to hide her whereabouts. The MY nights turned restless as I mulled over the situation. I told myself I'd confront her again, get to the bottom of this. But as the hours dragged on in the silent dark of our home, a heavier thought took hold. Maybe I wasn't prepared for the answer at all. The thought that she might be cheating was painful enough. But what if there was something even darker behind it? I couldn't help but recall small hints from previous conversations, vague allusions to meetings for work that now seemed suspect by the end of the week. The seed of suspicion had grown into an obsession. I started discreetly logging details. The times her phone was offline, the sporadic messages, the slight changes in her schedule. I even began comparing her usual routines with the anomalies. And then I noticed something else. A series of encrypted messages on her phone that I wasn't sure how to decipher. I felt both betrayed and compelled to know more. Every piece of evidence pointed to a hidden life, a double life that she had carefully concealed behind the veneer of our ordinary, happy marriage. I decided I needed to confront her again, this time with evidence. But a part of me hesitated, knowing that the conversation would likely unravel everything. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that her secret was not merely about infidelity. It was something deeper, something that threatened the very foundation of my trust. And I was determined to learn the truth, no matter how painful that night. As I sat alone in the dark living room, the silence pressing on me, the memory of that one moment, the simple act of disabling geolocation, had shattered my illusions. I knew that nothing would ever be the same again. I resolved that tomorrow, I begin an investigation into every digital footprint she left behind. I would uncover every hidden detail and force her to confront the truth. The betrayal, I told myself, would not go unanswered. Little did I know that the path I was about to embark on would lead me into a web of deception, danger, and violence far beyond my wildest fears. And it all started with a single, seemingly innocuous act. Disabling geolocation the next morning, I woke with a grim determination. My coffee tasted bitter as I sat down at the kitchen table, my mind replaying the events of the previous night. I knew I had to be methodical. I began by combing through the history on the family tracker app, noting the exact times Emily's location was missing. Patterns emerged. A few hours here, a late afternoon there, each gap correlating with vague explanations she had offered in passing, that I also managed to retrieve some old backup data from her phone when it was last synced to the cloud. There, I found subtle discrepancies in her location logs that suggested deliberate manipulation. It wasn't just that she'd turned off the tracker. It appeared that she had taken steps to hide her whereabouts for specific periods. My heart pounded as I pieced together these digital breadcrumbs. This wasn't a mistake. It was premeditated AT work that day. I barely managed to concentrate on my projects. Every ping of my phone, every passing thought, was consumed by the question, why did she need to hide? I recalled the half-hearted explanation from the night before, just a little privacy. But that now sounded like a feeble cover for a well-planned deception. I even considered reaching out to a tech-savvy friend for help in cracking any encrypted data on her phone, but my pride and the fear of uncovering too much held me back. When I returned home that evening, I found Emily in the living room, quietly reading on the couch. The atmosphere was tense, charged with unspoken words. I sat across from her, forcing casual conversation, all the while my mind racing. Finally, unable to hold back any longer, I broached the subject. I've noticed something odd with your phone's location settings lately. It's like you've been intentionally hiding your whereabouts. Her eyes widened for just a moment, a flash of something I couldn't quite place, a spark of guilt or maybe calculation. Ryan, you're overreacting, she said, her tone measured. Sometimes I need space, you know that, but I wasn't convinced. That night, while she slept, I dug deeper. I carefully examined her phone when she left it unattended on the kitchen counter. I discovered a series of messages from an unknown contact, coded language that mentioned meeting times and places. One message caught my attention. Tonight at the usual place. Make sure geolocation stays off. I felt my blood run cold. The phrase usual place implied a recurring meeting, and the explicit mention of geolocation confirmed my worst suspicions. This wasn't about a fleeting desire for privacy. It was about concealing something. Someone that my hands trembled as I backed up every incriminating detail. I began to build a dossier, logging the dates and times when her location had been switched off, cross-referencing them with the encrypted messages. I reached out to that tech-savvy friend in secret, asking if he could help decipher some of the codes. The more I uncovered, the deeper I sank into a vortex of betrayal. Every new piece of evidence stoked the flames of anger and hurt within me late that night. As I sat in my study surrounded by printouts and scribbled notes, I realized that the answer to why did she disable geolocation was far more complex and dangerous than I'd ever imagined. It wasn't simply about hiding an affair. It was about orchestrating meetings with someone whose identity was hidden behind layers of encryption and secrecy. The digital trail led me to vague references to a name I didn't recognize, Victor. The name was signed at the end of a couple of messages, almost as if it were a code word. Who was Victor, and what role did he play in all this? My mind raced with possibilities. Was Victor a secret lover? Or was he someone more sinister? A man who controlled a part of her life I had never known about? Every scenario I conjured up was worse than the last. My pulse quickened as I imagined the worst. That Emily wasn't merely cheating on me with some run-of-the-mill paramour, but with someone dangerous, someone who lurked in the shadows and whose intentions were far from honorable that night. I made up my mind. I would not sit idly by while my entire world crumbled. I started planning my next move, to track down Victor. I needed to know who he was, where he met with her, and what kind of danger he posed. I began combing through social media, searching for any trace of him. It wasn't long before I discovered a profile, an account with sparse details but an unmistakable air of menace. The profile picture was a shadowed image of a man with piercing eyes, and the post hinted at connections with underground circles. Every new discovery felt like a punch to the gut. The betrayal cut deeper with every clue I uncovered. I recalled the day we first installed the geolocation app, a day filled with innocent promises of safety and connectivity. Now, that same technology had become the instrument of my dawning nightmare. Emily had intentionally disabled it, not for a moment of self-care or personal privacy, but to hide something that was growing increasingly ominous. I couldn't shake the feeling that the digital evidence was only the surface of a much larger conspiracy, a web of lies and hidden agendas that had infiltrated my home. With anger fueling my resolve, I vowed that I would uncover every secret, every coded message, until I understood the full extent of her betrayal. And when I did, I'd make sure that the punishment was as brutal as the deception itself. As the clock ticked past midnight, I gathered my evidence and sat back, my mind a tumult of fury, pain, and a dangerous determination. I was no longer the trusting husband I once was. The discovery of her deliberate act of turning off geolocation was a catalyst for a journey into darkness, a journey that would force me to confront not only the woman I loved, but the shadowy figure behind her betrayal. Tomorrow, I'd take the next step, and nothing would ever be the same. In the days that followed, I transformed from a man hurt by betrayal into someone hell-bent on vengeance. Every waking moment was consumed by the need to understand the full extent of Emily's deception and the identity of this mysterious Victor. I became a shadow in my own life, quietly researching, tracking, and piecing together the puzzle she had so carefully hidden from me. My investigation led me to Victor's online footprint. His social media accounts were minimal and riddled with cryptic posts that hinted at connections to the underbelly of the city. I discovered that he was often associated with late-night meetings at a seedy bar on the outskirts of town, a place where the lines between business and criminality blurred. It was there that Emily had been meeting him, over and over again, all while her geolocation remained suspiciously off. With every new detail, my anger deepened. I recalled the encrypted messages. Meet at the usual place. Keep geolocation off. Victor. The fact that she took the time to ensure her digital footprint was erased revealed a level of premeditation that chilled me to the bone. This wasn't a simple affair. It was a covert operation, a clandestine liaison with a man whose very name resonated danger. And I wasn't content with being a passive observer any longer. Late one rainy night, I decided to stake out the bar. I parked my car a few blocks away, hidden in the shadows of a rundown alley, and waited. The neon sign of the Rusty Anchor flickered in the downpour as patrons came and went, oblivious to the drama unfolding just outside. I watched as a sleek black car pulled up and a woman, too familiar in her elegance, stepped out and entered the bar. My heart sank as I recognized her. It was Emily. The woman I trusted implicitly was now playing a dangerous game with a man named Victor. I spent hours watching from my car as she mingled with a group of individuals whose faces were hardened by life on the fringe. At one point, she and a tall, dark-haired man, presumably Victor, stepped outside for a private conversation. I strained to catch snippets of their dialogue, but the rain muffled the sound. All I got was the undeniable sight of her leaning in close, their expressions intense, secretive. That image burned itself into my mind, a stark confirmation that my worst fears were coming true as I drove home later. My thoughts churned with both fury and despair. Every moment of my past with Emily now seemed tainted by deception. The man I had once known, the kind, gentle husband, had become a stranger. And as I pieced together her actions, the truth grew darker. She wasn't simply cheating. She was entangled in something that went far beyond a clandestine romance. The implication was clear. Victor was not just a lover, but someone whose world was steeped in danger and criminality. I began to question everything. Had I been blind to warning signs? Every missed call, every evasive remark, now painted a picture of a life lived in double shadows. The pain of betrayal twisted into a burning need for retribution. I couldn't let this stand. I had to confront her, and I had to make Victor pay for dragging her into this nightmare. The thought of my wife being manipulated, possibly endangered, was intolerable. I resolved then that I would no longer be a victim of her deceit. I would take matters into my own hands, and that meant preparing myself both mentally and physically for what was to come, determined to get closer to Victor's world. I began frequenting the same bar. Under the cover of anonymity, I listened, observed, and gathered intelligence. I discovered that Victor was involved with a local crew known for small-time extortion and intimidation, a network of criminals that had their claws in many unsuspecting lives. The deeper I dug, the more I realized that this wasn't a simple love affair gone wrong. It was a collision between two very different worlds, and I was caught in the middle. My nights soon became filled with covert visits to the bar, scribbled notes in a battered notebook, and restless hours poring over social media accounts. I even managed to secure a friend's help in hacking into a few more data streams that revealed Emily's meeting logs. Each revelation drove a knife of betrayal deeper into my heart. The knowledge that she had carefully erased her digital footprints, that she had taken every measure to hide these meetings, was more than I could bear. It confirmed that she knew exactly what she was doing, and that she didn't care who got hurt. That I started to train myself physically as well. I took up late-night boxing classes and strength training at a local gym, channeling my mounting rage into every punch and every lift. I wasn't planning to simply confront her with words. I was preparing for a violent reckoning. My body, once unassuming and calm, was now a weapon honed by anger and loss. By the end of that week, the image of Victor's face and the memory of Emily's secret meetings were etched into my mind. I knew what I had to do next. I would track down Victor at his next known rendezvous. I would force a confrontation, one that would leave no doubt that betrayal comes with a brutal price. And if Emily tried to intervene, she would share in the consequences of her lies. As I closed my eyes that night, sleep eluded me. All I could think about was the devastation of trust, the cold calculations behind disabling geolocation, and the dangerous world my wife had chosen to be a part of. The answer to why she had turned off that digital safety net was now clear. It wasn't about protecting her privacy. It was about hiding a secret that was far more treacherous than I had ever imagined. I drifted off with one thought pulsing in my mind. Soon, the time would come to face them both. And when it did, I wouldn't hold back. The day of reckoning arrived on a humid Friday night. I had spent the past several days preparing meticulously, mapping out Victor's schedule and the layout of his usual haunts. My body ached from hours in the gym, and my mind was a sharpened blade of anticipation. I wasn't going to let this betrayal go unanswered. I had to confront Victor and, if necessary, drag Emily into the consequences of her choices. That I learned that Victor planned to meet with his crew at an abandoned warehouse on the edge of town, a known drop-off point for their illicit activities. It was the perfect target. isolated, dark, and rife with opportunity for a violent showdown. I arrived hours early, parking my car behind a row of dumpsters, the scent of damp concrete and decay mingling with the tension in my veins. I watched as shadows moved in and out of the warehouse's broken windows, every moment stretching out like an eternity inside. I crept through the perimeter, my pulse pounding so loudly I was sure it would give me away. I positioned myself near a side door, waiting for the opportune moment. I wasn't a stranger to violence anymore. I'd trained my body and hardened my soul for this very confrontation. I could hear muffled voices inside, the sound of rough laughter and low threats, a language that confirmed I was in the heart of enemy territory then, as if drawn by fate. The door swung open and out stepped Victor himself. Tall, with a cold, calculating stare, he scanned the area as if expecting trouble. That moment, our eyes met. For a fraction of a second, I saw not just arrogance in his gaze, but a flicker of uncertainty. It was as if he sensed the storm that was about to break. Without a word, I lunged from the shadows. The ensuing fight was a blur of brutal exchanges, fists flying, grunts echoing in the cavernous space. I struck with a fury born of betrayal and heartbreak, every blow a reckoning for every lie Emily had fed me. Victor was agile and dangerous. He fought back with a ferocity that matched my own. For every punch I landed, he countered with swift, calculated moves. The sound of bones cracking and heavy breaths filled the air as our confrontation escalated into a vicious melee amid the chaos. I heard footsteps behind me. I turned sharply to see Emily, her eyes wide with terror and regret. In that instant, everything became painfully clear. She had been caught between two worlds, and now she was paying the price. But there was no time for words or pleas for mercy. I was beyond negotiation. My anger demanded that everyone involved taste the consequences. Victor managed to break free for a moment, drawing a concealed weapon, a cold, glinting knife. I dodged his thrust and countered with a heavy blow that sent him reeling. The fight became a savage dance of violence. Where mercy was a luxury I could no longer afford. I grabbed him, pinned him against a rusted metal beam, and with a low, ragged growl, I whispered, "You ruined everything." In that moment, the taste of blood and the smell of sweat were all that existed. I knew I was inflicting pain that would haunt him for life. Emily tried to intervene, her voice cracking as she pleaded, "Ryan, stop. Please, I'm sorry. I never meant for it to go this far." But her words fell on deaf ears. Every swing, every crushing blow I delivered was a manifestation of the years, of deception and the ultimate betrayal of trust. I wasn't merely fighting for revenge. I was fighting to reclaim the honor that had been ripped from me when the battle finally subsided. Victor lay battered on the cold concrete, barely clinging to life. I stood over him, breathing hard, the adrenaline slowly ebbing away to reveal a crushing emptiness. I turned to face Emily, whose eyes were brimming with tears of regret and fear. The warehouse echoed with silence as I delivered a final, venomous ultimatum. This is only the beginning. If you ever try to hide another truth from me, I won't hesitate again. My voice was cold, final. A man who had already crossed the line between love and vengeance. I left the warehouse that night with Victor bound and waiting for the authorities, or for whatever punishment fate would have in store. But as I drove away, I couldn't shake the haunting realization that nothing, not even this brutal confrontation, would ever restore the life I once knew. The betrayal was etched permanently into my soul, and the aftermath. The days blurred into one long, agonizing reality. I returned to a home that felt both empty and suffocating, every room echoing with memories of trust and laughter that had long since vanished. Emily was silent, her eyes avoiding mine, as if every glance carried the weight of guilt. I had exacted my revenge on Victor, but the damage extended far beyond one man's broken body. The knowledge that she had deliberately disabled geolocation to hide her secret, this dangerous liaison that jeopardized everything we built, was a wound that festered every night. I replayed the confrontation in my mind, the sound of fists colliding, the terror in Victor's eyes, and the pleading in Emily's voice. I had become a creature of vengeance, a man who no longer recognized the gentle husband I once was. My body bore scars from the fights, but the deepest marks were etched in my soul. I had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed yet as time passed. I began to wonder if retribution had truly brought the closure I craved. I roamed the quiet streets at night, haunted by the ghosts of my own actions. I visited Victor in the hospital one evening, only to see the look of brokenness in his eyes, a mirror of the chaos I had unleashed. His suffering was a constant reminder that the price of betrayal is measured in blood, pain, and irreparable loss. Emily tried to reach out, whispering apologies and begging for forgiveness, but every word from her only deepened the chasm between us. I couldn't trust her anymore. The geolocation incident was not a one-off mistake. It was the first deliberate act of deception in a long line of lies. I realized that my life, once filled with the promise of an ordinary American dream, was now a series of calculated, cold acts of vengeance. I had become both the avenger and the victim of my own rage. That I, in the final days, I sat alone in our empty living room, reviewing the digital evidence that had started it all. The timeline was damning. The moments when her location went dark, the encrypted messages signed by Victor, and the night of the brutal confrontation that shattered all remnants of trust. I understood, with a grim clarity, that sometimes the truth is worse than any imagined nightmare. Her decision to disable geolocation wasn't about a fleeting need for privacy. It was about concealing a life of lies that ultimately dragged us both into a spiral of destruction now. As dawn broke one last time over the ruined remnants of our once happy home, I packed my belongings and stepped out into an uncertain future. I wasn't sure if I could ever reclaim what I'd lost, or if I'd forever be defined by the path of vengeance I'd chosen. All I knew was that the betrayal had changed me irreversibly. I had sought retribution with every ounce of my being, and while I had succeeded in making those responsible suffer, I had also condemned myself to a lifetime of darkness and regret. As I drove away from that final chapter, with the rising sun painting the horizon in hues of red and gold, I whispered a final thought to myself. Why did she disable geolocation? The answer was worse than I ever imagined, and with that, I merged onto the open road, a lone avenger, forever scarred by betrayal, determined to find a semblance of peace in a world that had become nothing short of a battleground. End of story.